tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Good morning to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. My name is Murray Bruges. I am the director of the Helen Clark Foundation Mahi Aotearoa. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's conversation exploring the funding and financing of New Zealand's infrastructure. I'd first like to acknowledge our wonderful partners at WSP in New Zealand, whose support and expertise helps us to develop long-term solutions to a range of issues related to sustainable urban environments in New Zealand, including our most recent report, Bridging the Infrastructure Gap, the focus of today's webinar. As always, a very warm welcome to our Helen Clark Foundation members. Our foundation is an evidence-based, independent, non-partisan think tank, and we could not do this work without your support. If you're not a member, but you find these sessions valuable, you can sign up to become a member on our website, Helen Clark, that's all one word, .foundation. Before we begin today's webinar, I'll just quickly note our foundation has another webinar running at midday tomorrow, looking at the global implications of the US presidential elections. You can register on our website, or we'll paste a link in the comments section shortly. We'll also have another webinar on congestion charging in the next couple of months, co-hosted with the New Zealand initiative. If you're on our mailing lists, you'll shortly be notified of dates and we'll be able to register then. So for those of you who haven't joined many of our webinars before, it's worth noting this is a webinar, not a normal Zoom call. Your cameras and microphones are off, so there's no risk anyone can see or hear you sipping your tea or coffee. As always, we'd love for you to participate in this webinar, and the best way to do so is to submit questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar by typing them into Zoom's Q&A function, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen. You can also see and like other people's questions in that section by clicking on the thumbs up button. And the more you do that to a particular question, the more likely that question is to be asked. At around the 40-minute mark, we'll put those questions to our panelists. And you'll also see there is a separate chat function. We'll use that section to put some links during the webinar, but please do submit your questions in the Q&A area. And finally, we're always looking to improve our webinars, so we'd love to hear your views on today's session. You should receive a Zoom feedback form in the next day or so, and in the window as you finish, as this webinar finishes today. And that form takes about 2 minutes to complete. We read all the responses and take your feedback into account when designing future webinars. So that's it for housekeeping. Just before I hand over to our Foundation's Deputy Director, Carly Mercier, I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Vinny, then Leilani, then Simon, then Carly, who will go on to give us an overview of her excellent report before we get into the panel discussion proper. So Vinny, over to you to start with the introductions.
Thanks very much, Murray, and good morning, everyone. My name is Vinny Minette. I'm Director of Investments at WSP in New Zealand. My career has been across the commercial and financial elements of infrastructure projects, both in New Zealand and 5 years in North America, where I worked across the continent on privately financed and alternatively delivered projects. Over to you, Leilani.
Yeah, kia ora. E mana e reo e rangatira nā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko aho he tai hautu o te timu puria tau hoku te taiohanga. Ko Leilani Fru toko ingoa. So very, very warm hello to everybody. My name is Leilani Fru. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Financial and Commercial in the Treasury. It's a role that covers a number of commercial and financial businesses and operations of Treasury, including the world of infrastructure and transport. I won't go into where I came from or my background, save time, but I'm looking forward to this discussion and very pleased to be here.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Simon Randall. I'm the Policy Advocacy Manager here at Local Government New Zealand. I've spent about sort of 16 years of my career in various parts of local government, and infrastructure is a really important part of what local government does. We're responsible for 25% of all infrastructure in New Zealand, and funding and financing is a key concern for us on how we do that. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, karanga mai, mihi mai, ko Carly Mercier toko ingoa. I'm, as Murray said, Deputy Director at the Helen Clark Foundation, and I'm a WSP Fellow, which means I work together with WSP to produce 2 long-form policy documents each year on interesting topics relating to infrastructure, climate change, and sustainable urban design. And our latest one is Bridging the Infrastructure Gap, which I'm going to talk to you about today. And then we're going to get into some good discussions about it also. So let me just share my screen. Before I start, I want to quickly go over just a short definition. What is the difference between funding and finance? Those terms are often used interchangeably. They're actually quite different things. So funding's about who pays for the infrastructure. That could be the taxpayers, the ratepayers, or anyone who pays a fee to use a particular service. And then financing is about the methods used to cover the upfront costs for the investment. So let's say you're wanting to buy a washing machine, your salary or your income is going to pay for that washing machine. That's going to be the funding, but you may also want to borrow some money to get it quicker. So that's the financing. Very simple, but quite different, and important to bear those differences in mind when you start to talk about how different things can be funded and financed. So what is the problem that we are trying to address? So New Zealand has been, you would have read about this in the news, I'm sure, but New Zealand has been dramatically underinvesting in essential infrastructure for several decades now. As a country, we sort of invest and underinvest in waves. And it's we've been underinvesting in a big way for about the last 30 years, and it's coming to a head. So a lot of our infrastructure is aging out at the same time. We've sweated a lot of it to the very nth degree, to the breaking point, and now we kind of have to get on and replace some things. So our biggest shortfalls are in things like transport, water infrastructure, energy, and housing. If we continue to invest at current rates, essentially some experts predict a shortfall of around $210 billion over the next 30 years. So we should be spending around about double what we are spending each year, essentially. And then, of course, we've got a lot of pressures coming up. We've got population growing in the next 10 to 15 years or so. We're probably going to hit 6 million from a current 5 million population. And a lot of that population growth is going to be happening in a few key cities. And then we've also got climate change to contend with. So all of those things are putting added strain on our infrastructure as well. You often might hear that we spend roughly equivalent to other countries on infrastructure, but when I looked into it in more detail, I found that actually the problem is not that we're not efficient. The problem is that we're actually spending per capita quite a bit less than other countries in the OECD. If you look at it as a proportion of GDP, we're about average, but if you look at it as a proportion of per capita, we're in the lowest half of countries and what they spend. And the report really argues that we should be spending actually a lot more than other countries per capita. And that's for a few different reasons. One is that we have this big shortfall to catch up on. Another is that we have really unique challenges as a country. We're long, thin, very sparsely populated in some places. We have a lot of seismic issues. We have a lot of exposure to natural hazards as well, and to coastal erosion and slips and things like that. So for all of those reasons, we argue we should actually be spending quite a bit more at the moment overall. There's also the question, should we be improving our efficiency? And I found there was a lack of really good quality international benchmarking data about how efficiently we spend overall compared to other countries. But what there is suggests we perform reasonably well on most types of infrastructure. Perhaps a little bit less well on some of those more complex things like tunnelling, which we don't do very often. But I think given our geographical challenges in New Zealand, I think we do pretty well in terms of efficiency. However, that is not to say we shouldn't be upping our game. All countries, I think, can really improve, especially in reducing cost and time overruns and things like that. And there's quite a lot we could be doing there to try and get more for our buck, I guess. One of the really big things that came out of the research was this issue of boom and bust. One of the key reasons I think we're in this underinvestment sort of situation is politically driven. So changing priorities from different successive governments causes waste and foregone opportunities for economic growth, because they'll often pull out of a project for, I guess, political reasons. And I'm not casting blame on any particular government here. This happens every time there's a change of government, and has done historically. So the sort of flip-flopping costs us a lot of money, because not only have we sunk lots of consultancy fees and things into projects, but also we've, the longer it takes to build infrastructure, the more it costs, and the more, you've lost foregone a lot of economic benefits from not having that infrastructure available to use. And one really good example of that is probably the Auckland Harbour Bridge. When it opened in 1959, it was already under capacity. It had originally supposed to be 7 lanes of driving and 2 lanes of walking and cycling, but it was reduced at the last minute to save money. And ever since then, we've been trying to come up with a solution to that, and flip-flopping back and forth from different proposals. And then 60 years later, we are unfortunately still sitting there with no solution. So that's a great example of how we're sort of missing out on opportunities, because we are not able to agree a long-term vision on how we do our infrastructure provision. And so one of the main recommendations from the report is that we should be really locking down a long-term pipeline for infrastructure investment, and that we need to get multi-party buy-in for that as much as possible. We could save, according to some estimates, billions of dollars each year. I don't know if that's right or not, but it seems a lot. But we can certainly save a huge amount from doing that. So because we don't have enough money stashed away to pay for everything we need right now, the bulk of new investment will almost certainly have to be financed by debt. And there are several advantages to financing infrastructure by debt. Borrowing allows the cost of the project to be spread out over time, and it also allows more to be built now and more quickly. And it also is generally seen as quite equitable, because you're spreading the cost of the infrastructure over time. So all the people who use it over the next 20, 30 years are paying for it gradually over its lifetime. You may have heard there's not very much headroom to borrow more, but I don't think that's right, looking at the evidence. So compared to other countries, we actually have quite a low debt. And it's pretty clear we could be borrowing quite a bit more without it affecting our credit rating also. So according to Standard & Poor's, New Zealand could borrow as much as $120 billion before risking any credit rating downgrade. I'm not recommending we borrow 120 billion, by the way. That's just to say that, we do have a bit of headroom and wiggle room in there to be borrowing more to pay for those kind of infrastructure projects that are going to bring economic growth to New Zealand. And similarly at local government level, and Simon can talk more about this later, but at local government level, some councils could certainly be looking to be borrowing more than they are also, although there are obvious constraints there in terms of them having the revenue to be able to pay back their debts. So there are different types of borrowing. I'll just very quickly explain these, and hopefully we can get into more about this in the discussion as well. But central and local government can borrow from banks and other investors based on their reputation as a safe bet for paying that money back. And so they do that by issuing bonds, for example, and then they can spend that money on whatever projects they want to. And that's often referred to as public debt, because the government or councils are the ones raising the finance and using their revenue to pay for it. They can also borrow for a specific project. So private investment, for example, can take many forms, but let's say the government decides to set up a public-private partnership to build 10 new schools. In that case, they might contract with a private partner or a group of partners to design and build and maintain the schools over the long term, and also to sort out the financing for that project. So in that case, the private partner would bring the finance to the partnership, and then the government would pay that back over time. For local government, there's also a couple of other options. So most council debt, I think around 90%, is financed through the Local Government Funding Agency, LGFA. That was established in 2011 to deliver efficient financing for local government by pooling councils' borrowing power. So LGFA borrows cheaply from domestic and international lenders, and then lends that money to member councils. It's slightly more expensive in terms of interest than central government borrowing, but not much. And And then a council, I won't go into detail on this here, but a council can also borrow for a specific project under a fairly new piece of legislation, the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act 2020. This method of borrowing has only been used a couple of times so far, once in Wellington, once in Tauranga. And the advantage of it is that councils can borrow for specific projects off their balance sheets, which means they can then borrow more than they'd otherwise be able to borrow under current LGFA borrowing limits. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time because I tend to go on about topics I'm passionate about. Fairness principles. So just before we talk about the funding side of things, the report goes into a lot of detail about the different fairness principles by which we should establish who pays for what. And I think it's really the crux of the matter. So the public discourse about who should pay is sometimes focused on this benefit principle, which is the principle that the person who uses the infrastructure should pay for it. Makes logical sense, but there are actually several principles, and often they conflict with one another. The exacerbator principle, that is linked to the benefit principle, but it's the opposite. So it's the principle that whoever causes a need for the use of costly resources, maybe someone who pollutes a river or causes congestion, that they should pay for it. Horizontal equity is a tax principle that citizens with the same characteristics should pay the same tax. So for example, a person who uses the same amount of water as another person should pay the same amount. Vertical equity is about the idea that citizens with greater ability to pay should pay more tax than those with less ability to pay, which is known as a progressive tax. And that might be based on your income, your consumption, your wealth, or your property value. But basically the idea is that the more you have, the more you would pay. Intergenerational equity is about, well, it's on what it says on the tin, is about the idea that we should be seeking fairness across generations. So we shouldn't have one generation paying the bulk of something and then another generation gets to enjoy that without paying anything for it. And tax incidence is not really a fairness principle. It's more about just being aware that sometimes you might put a tax on something, but it's actually someone else who pays for it. For example, rates are a tax on property owners, but the cost of rates is also passed on to renters. So just being aware of who ends up actually paying for things. Yeah, so all of those principles involve value judgments. They also often conflict with one another, as I said. And so the report essentially argues it's really important to take into account all of these different principles when making decisions on infrastructure funding and financing. So funding, this is the actual tough bit. I think it's harder to get funding for things than it is finance, it seems to me. So it's about who pays for the infrastructure. Is it you or is it me? So I think things get a bit messy when the public narrative starts to conflate funding and financing. For example, the government might get someone to finance a big new project, but that isn't the same as them paying for the project. So the key message from me is that there's no magic bullet to fund infrastructure. It's all just us guys paying, but in different ways. So no magical fairy is going to come down and pay for any of this, this deficit that we've built up for ourselves. So the question then becomes, I think, what is the fairest, most efficient, most effective way to pay for things? And the answer, I think, will be a bit different for different types of infrastructure. Taxation has the advantage of being quite straightforward and efficient to collect, which makes it quite a cheap way to fund things. It also has good levers to address questions of equity because it's progressive, or income tax is progressive and based on the ability to pay. Other types of tax, such as wealth, inheritance, capital gains tax, also have the added advantage of transferring wealth between generations and tapping into that intergenerational equity principle. But of course, raising taxes to pay for infrastructure is not popular. Rates, the advantage of rates is that you pay locally for what you use locally, so it encourages accountability. But the disadvantage is that rates can be a blunt tool. So you pay rates based on property value rather than based on the ability to pay. So you also pay per property rather than by individual. And that means that some people end up paying substantially more than others who use the same amount of infrastructure. And as you will also be aware, there's a limit to how much you can raise rates before it becomes untenable for many people and they start to really struggle financially. which is obviously not desirable from a social point of view. So the people who tend to suffer, when rates go up a lot, are those who are on low or fixed incomes. And then user charges, this is where direct users or beneficiaries of infrastructure pay, for example, via road tolls, via water charges. Attaching revenue to infrastructure provision means more infrastructure can be built more quickly because it takes pressure off debt repayments. And then attaching revenue to infrastructure can also lead to its more efficient use. And one great example there would be, for example, Kapiti Coast District Council bought in water meters and started charging for people for their water use, and that very quickly led to the discovery of hundreds of leaks which were able to be fixed, and they reduced the amount of water lost to leakage by 90%, and private use also reduced about 26%. So yeah, putting user charges can lead to some good outcomes in addition to just building revenue. Disadvantages of user charges, of course, is that they can sometimes be expensive to administer and they're sometimes not very efficient. So this type of approach, I think, is best used where it brings other benefits in addition to just revenue. And also to note, it's really important to consider questions of equity, making decisions about user charging approaches, because they essentially distribute the requirement to pay in different ways across populations. So we need to be mindful of where that cost ends up falling. I think in most funding decisions, you're going to find that the fairest, most efficient, most effective way to fund something is going to be via a mix of taxation rates and user charges. But I think the main thing is really that you're having that discussion for each different type of funding decision rather than leaping straight to one model over another one. Right, so just briefly run through our recommendations, and then we're gonna turn to the panel discussion. There's a lot of recommendations in this report. It's quite a long report. I really recommend you have a look if you're interested, but I've just summarized the top 7 recs here, and I'll go through them very quickly. So the first one is, obviously, I mentioned before that we should be developing a long-term vision as a country. We'll be saving a huge amount of money if we did that, reducing a lot of wastage, and that will require a long-term plan that is bought into by all the different parties. I also talked, I touched briefly on the fact that we could be getting more from our infrastructure investment. We've been focusing probably too little on maintenance. It's easy to turn to shiny new projects that win votes than it is to do the boring old maintenance. So I think we could do better at keeping what we've already got in a good state. And then we could also do a lot better at reducing cost and time overruns. And that's worth having a go at. I think we need to be using a range of approaches to funding and financing infrastructure, and we should be looking at all the different potential ways that we can do that. But we do need, as a country, to be recognising that the bulk of our needs will be financed by debt and will be funded by all of us, mostly through taxation and rates, and that we all need to be responsible for, I think, building up a bit of a public mandate for that increased investment that we're going to be needing. No one wants to spend money. Sometimes it's actually necessary. And I think voters also need to be hearing their leaders saying buying stuff costs money, guys. Local councils also clearly need more money. They're really struggling, and we go into some detail on this in the report, and Simon can no doubt tell you more as well, but several large reports and reviews have highlighted that local government needs more revenue, so we need to be looking at ways to do that, whether it's asking central government to pay rates on their property, or whether it's dropping the need to pay GST on rates, so that more money goes into council coffers from rates. There are a lot of ways we could be doing this, but it's pretty clear we need to be doing at least one of them, and preferably several. So user charges option, as I said, are also definitely worth looking into as a supplementary form of funding. They include things like value capture and tolls and user charges, especially where those approaches bring additional benefits. But I do think that those approaches are likely to be supplementary in most cases. They're more likely to be the icing than the cake in terms of funding. We should also be ensuring those fairness principles are used to consider questions on funding and financing as much as possible. And we talked a lot in the report then about PPPs. PPPs cause a bit of division in New Zealand, which is interesting because in some countries they're a lot less contentious politically, and the report really aimed to give an objective look at the research around how they work and come up with a range of recommendations focused on, the recommendations basically were around the idea that if we do them here, we need to get the best out of them. We don't want to be repeating the mistakes that other countries have made. And I think the most important point there is probably the importance of fitting the type of procurement that we use to the project. So, sometimes a PPP will be the best approach and sometimes it won't. So we don't want to go into it just, loving one procurement over another one and not sort of applying it to the specific project. And another key conclusion was really the importance of doing better research in this space, because there's not a lot of really good quality independent research out there on PPPs, despite the fact that they've been around for several decades now, which I thought was surprising. But yeah, well worth looking into the report if you're interested in PPPs. I think we've dedicated 20 or 30 pages to them. And then finally, we looked at city and regional deals, and I think I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but we can discuss that more in the chat if people would like to. So I'm going to end it there and say thank you for listening, and look forward to now having a bit of a chat with the panelists.
Thank you, Carly, for that lightning run through a very comprehensive report. So we'll now start the panel session, and I'll put the first kind of scene setter to Leilani, Simon, and Vinny. You'll have heard a central through line for Carly's report there. The general problem definition is that New Zealand has been underinvesting in infrastructure, and we need to be spending more going forward than we are currently. I'd just like to ask each of you to respond to that point. Do you broadly agree? If so, why? If not, why not? Who would like to go first?
I'll jump in if you want, Murray. So I strongly agree with that point, but I think it's slightly caveated in that we need to make sure we're spending on the right things, we're procuring those things in an efficient way. And, Carly mentioned there, most importantly, that we're budgeting and spending appropriate amounts on the ongoing asset management of our existing and new infrastructure. From memory, the Infrastructure Commission released a report recently that said something like we need to be spending 60 cents of every dollar on renewing existing assets. So as we do increase our spend on infrastructure, we need to make sure that we're increasing that spend proportionately as well, and making the most of what we do have, and that anything we deliver new does last as long as it's meant to, and benefits those generations that it's meant to benefit.
I'll jump in now. Yeah, completely agree that we need to be investing more in infrastructure. Agree with Vinny that it needs to be the right infrastructure, and that we also need to get the settings in the system right. So it's not just money needed, but the whole system needs to function better to deliver the right outcomes for infrastructure.
So I'll add my 2 cents worth. So I think, I guess what the report's highlighted is that, this question, I suppose, is complex. There's many considerations, some conflicting, some complementary, which I think, presents a real navigation challenge to the solutions. The risk, I guess, is overcomplication or overcomplicating the way that we actually address and solve some of the issues raised by the report. The other risk is oversimplifying as well. So I think we've all got to think about that balance. From my perspective, I think, it takes a village to kind of, take on this challenge. And so there was roles for central and local and private sector to play in addressing the investment needed. But I think the key point is that the 3 players need to do it together, and certainly integration and the way that we partner can certainly be improved to do it together. I totally agree with the points raised by the other panelists around we really need long-term planning, but again, integrated central and local government planning, not just local and not just central. I agree that we need to have the use of, right funding from the right sources. So, but similarly, there is a role here in the funding space for central and local government. And of course, we can't forget Carly's key point is that both of us get our funding from the 5 million citizens of New Zealand. So how, again, that is integrated and thought about in an integrated way is important. And then both kind of needing to demonstrate value for money and what that means. So from my perspective, it is about, our existing assets, investing in our existing assets or not, whatever the case may be, and being really clear about that. Deliverability, cost estimation as well is something we could definitely do better to ensure that we are getting that more effective and efficient investment. So that was sort of my perspectives in terms of the report. So the short answer is yes, and a number of other observations.
Kia ora, Leilani. Thank you for that. Another question to the three of you. So turning to the report's finding that we can and should be financing more infrastructure by borrowing, both at the central and local government level. Is that something you each agree needs to happen? Is borrowing the best approach? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of debt financing of infrastructure? Why don't we start with you this time, Simon?
Thanks, Murray, for that question. I mean, debt's a useful tool, and councils utilise it and agree with the finding that some councils could be using it more. To Carly's point, it spreads sort of the cost of that infrastructure over the life of its assets, so it hits some of those equity issues. And some of the infrastructure we're talking about, stock banks could be 200 years worth of infrastructure that we're investing in once. Roading, pipes, those sorts of things, 50 to 100 years worth of assets. So it's good to, from an equity point of view, spread those costs across all users. It's not necessarily the best tool for all councils. Some councils are quite constrained by debt ceilings and debt limits, particularly high growth councils. So those are the ones that are needing to cope the most with growth. And I guess on the other side of it, some councils are constrained in terms of how much they can borrow, not by debt ceilings, but by the need to service that debt and the ability for ratepayers to pay the interest on those new assets. And that creates some challenges as well. Having a slightly higher threshold means that you can kind of solve the second problem by restructuring debt over a longer period. So you pay more in interest, but individual ratepayers year on year pay a little bit less. That might be useful, but debt alone isn't going to solve this challenge unless we deal with the funding side of things. Would be the point that I'd make here. I guess also a political point. Carly hits the nail on the head that debt is seen as bad by some ratepayers, and there are some concerns about councils taking on debt. I'd also note that central government in the past have pointed to councils taking on debt as a bad thing, and currently in the Local Government Act we have constraints that benchmarking and things like that have been imposed by the Local Government Act that almost pushes councils to take on less debt or look at alternatives, which is generally about underinvestment or, as Carly says, sweating assets.
Vinny, Leilani, any further comments?
I can add a couple. Look, I think it's interesting, I suppose, Carly, in the report, how you couldn't find a lot of comparables per capita for New Zealand. Oh, sorry, that your advice, that your report highlighted that per capita we were spending less than our typical comparable, which is a percentage of GDP spend. And I think the question for me is, so when I think about some similarities in respect of New Zealand, I think about Queensland. So I may not think about Australia as a whole, but I do think about Queensland, as you say, long, thin, big concentration of population in a particular area of Queensland vis-a-vis other parts, high regional and disproportionate urban, similar population, I suppose. And, what is their infrastructure spend versus ours? And, if you look at their forecasts, I think their budget came out at 107 billion or something, including existing commitments over the next 4 years. So maybe they are more comparable to on a per capita, maybe some of the other data points. So in that, I think, if we think about what we've got committed across, from the centre, I think we have a significant number of billions of dollars over the forecast period, over 60 odd billion dollars. Some's underway, some is in procurement, a lot is in planning, but also the absorption ability from the market to meet that. And I know there's lots of commentary around whether or not the pipeline's dried up or not, but I think there's an existing amount of investment already in the pipes. So how we make that transparent seems to be the greater issue than the fact that there is not a significant investment going. I still think, though, that if I guess your point in your report around efficiency and productivity is interesting to kind of observe what you concluded. I do think we have a ways to go in terms of improving how we efficiently deploy capital into the space and spend it and improve our productivity in New Zealand. We are one of the lowest countries in the OECD in terms of our productivity metrics, but then I think many of the countries in OECD will say that they also are quite low. So what does that mean when it comes to should we borrow more or not? I think Simon hit it on the head. It's about funding and affordability, whether or not we've got capacity. And I think from a central perspective, we do need to think about capacity for shocks. We've increased our debt levels by 130% since pre-COVID. And so we've had COVID and we've had the North Island events as well. So, as you say, we have some uniqueness in New Zealand that we do need to ensure that we preserve capacity for, borrowing capacity included. So I think we need to make sure that we are considering that headroom and not just all of the headroom that's available in, whether it's local or central government balance sheets for that matter, since we both play a role in both investment and shock management. But I think the key point is around affordability. So it does come back to the funding question, which I do think is some area that we do need to, continually strengthen and improve our ability to pay for whatever infrastructure, whether we borrow for it or just pay directly for it upfront.
Good, Leilani. Vinny, any comments from you on that question?
Just really quickly, Murray, I think I agree with Simon and Leilani, but we're gonna have to borrow to get ourselves out of this deficit. We can't cash fund. If we were starting on a nice equal footing, we might be able to have a discussion of do we want to cash fund or borrow, but we're going to have to borrow to get ourselves out of it. The key is going to be delivering efficiently, and I think Leilani hit the nail on the head with productivity and efficiency. There was an article recently that week, and it was mentioned in the report that we could borrow over $100 billion tomorrow and not affect our country's credit rating. But the impact that something like that would have on construction escalation would just be astronomical. We would not be able to efficiently deliver that. So we need to think about how we're procuring our infrastructure, who's delivering our infrastructure, who the people are, both the people on the ground, but also the people in the leadership positions in these projects, the program directors, the project managers, who is doing that. And we need to be, it comes back a lot to that bipartisan pipeline, giving confidence to those sort of people to have careers in those roles, and to stay in New Zealand and to continue to deliver kind of project after project. So I think, yes, we need to borrow and we need to be mature about a willingness to borrow, but then we need to apply that borrowing to the right projects in the right ways.
Great, thanks, Vinny. Now, I was about to remind our viewers to put their questions into the Q&A. I see we've already got more than we're likely to be able to get through today. So if you'd like to see a particular question asked, please do vote on that question, and that'll increase the chances that we get to it before the end of the session. So the next question is on private investment. So another way to finance infrastructure is through private investment. That could be a public-private partnership, often called a PPP. So all our viewers are on the same page about what a PPP is. Vinny, could you please explain that in plain terms, how they work, comparing to non-PPP or public models?
Sure. I think the first thing is to remember that PPP is a procurement model. It's not a financing model. I think if you went and asked an uninformed member of the public about what their favorite procurement model is, they might look at you blankly. But then if you ask them what they'd think about PPPs, there'd be a lot of emotion. And it's always confused me that there's a lot of emotion in this. People seem to either love them or hate them, which isn't an amount of passion that's given to alliances or design builds or early contractor involvement, all of which are also models of procurement. Taking it back to the school example that Kelly talked about earlier, in traditional, so non-PPP procurement, if the government wanted to build a new school, it would go out and hire a design firm, design the school. It would take that design out to market and get a quote from contractors to build the school. It would often pick the lowest price, although there's been a move towards price quality recently. Following construction, the government would hire a firm to maintain the asset through its life. If something was to go wrong with that asset a decade or so into its life, in case of, for example, leaky schools, which we've had some experience with here, there would be little ability to seek recourse from any of the private parties that were involved in that project earlier on. That's something called interface risk. Every time you have a contract handover from one party to another, you create an interface, and in that case, the government holds those interfaces. In the PPP example, the government would go out to market for one consortium to design, build, and maintain that school. And because no payment will be made to that consortium until the school's complete, they must raise private finance to pay for the design and construction phase. Once the school's built, payment to both repay the private finance and pay the ongoing maintenance costs is made based on the availability and performance of that school. If there's an issue with the school through its life, if it's unavailable, or if the performance measures, the predefined performance measures aren't met, then the government has the ability to withhold payment. I think like all procurement models, there's a toolbox, and PPPs aren't right for every project. But if we do look at the unique attributes of projects, the unique attributes of the market we have, the different owners, we can deliver them in a way that has the ability to bring significant benefits, particularly to the end users, in this case, the students in that school.
Thanks, Vinny. Can I ask our other panelists for any very quick reflections, as we're already a little pressed for time, before we move on to our last question before the audience Q&A?
I could make a quick comment. So I, in the report, made a big effort to try and get to the bottom of what the various international research said on PPPs, because there's so much division. I was really fascinated to know what the research and evidence actually said, and it was, as I said before, surprisingly thin on the ground in terms of really good quality independent evidence. But the research was really clear that PPPs do save a lot of money on cost and time overruns, really significant amounts in some cases. And one of the reasons for that is that private partners don't get paid until they complete the contract to a required standard, and meanwhile they have the requirement to be paying back the money that they've financed. So they're in huge trouble if they don't get it done on time, so they'll pull out all the stops to do that. The other argument about PPPs, or that people say is good about PPPs, is that they provide value for money throughout the lifetime of the project, and Vinny just talked about that. Unfortunately, the research on that is not super great in terms of, there's not clear evidence out there one way or another that they definitely cost the similar amount but provide a better service, for example. And so one of the report's findings was that we really need better research, not just about PPP models, but also other procurement models as well, just to really get to the bottom of what's best and what's best in which situation, and what are the drawbacks and the advantages of each type of model. And yeah, I think because PPPs can be really long-term contracts, they have sort of unique risks, and we need to be really aware of that, and we need to be really careful that we have great capacity and capability in government to be able to manage those really quite complex projects, and just that we also really careful that we learn from all the experiences that other countries have had overseas, that they can go spectacularly wrong. other forms of procurement can also go spectacularly wrong. I don't think that's necessarily just limited to PPPs, but I think we need to just make sure we learn from prior mistakes and that we also do really good research on them as well.
Thanks, Carly. Vinny. A final question to the panel for very brief answers, please. So we've got time to go through some of our audience Q&A. So we've just covered off the financing side of the equation. The other key element here is funding. However, a project might be financed, we still have to pay back the money. The report talks about the three main ways to fund infrastructure, being taxation, rates, and user charges. Interested in panelists' quick reflections on how best to balance these different options. What are some of the considerations that might make one option better than another in a particular circumstance, or are they perhaps different for different types of infrastructure? So quick reflections from the panel on that one, please.
Just jumping in with a local government perspective, I mean, I think from our view, it needs to be all three, probably across all of our infrastructure. And noting Leilani's very good point earlier about the relationship to the ability to borrow and funding in this space. Just one reflection is I think we need a toolbox type approach in terms of funding and financing tools that are available to tailor to individual projects. And it's not just about funding, it's also about efficiency and incentives. So for instance, local government's disincentivized by growth. Things get more expensive for councils if communities are growing because we need to provide and service infrastructure, sometimes ahead of rating-based growth. And so things like extra housing, tourism, those sorts of things, all add cost to local government because we're so bound by rates. But things like bed taxes, GST sharing on new builds, not only does that provide a funding source, but it incentivizes councils to be investing in that kind of growth and supporting economic productivity, which is really good for New Zealand. And also, as Carly mentioned earlier, the right funding tools can also make infrastructure more efficient and delay when you need to take on debt to invest in infrastructure. So volumetric charging for water is a really good example of not only does it reduce kind of the amount of water and the leaks and things, but it means that it could be 10 more years before you need to expand or upgrade infrastructure.
Thanks, Simon. Last opportunity for Leilani or Vinny to comment briefly on that before we get into the audience Q&A.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I mentioned before that I think the challenge is trying to solve the funding side. And I think, you know, that is a challenge that we all need to sort of grip up and try to figure out how to work that way through, regardless of how it's split around taxes or rates or beneficiary type of or user pays type of mechanisms. You know, if we took the same approach, I guess the report talk in terms of a per capita spend, what is the per capita affordability of our 5 million citizens in New Zealand? So what would be the dollar per capita that we would say we can afford to spend, citizens can afford to contribute towards infrastructure investment, creating an affordability envelope that's intergenerational. And then for that, what can we do in terms of investment in infrastructure? So we know it's easier to kind of do the bottom up, this is what we need to spend and this is what we need to spend on. But if it was constrained or not, if it had not a constraint, if it had an affordability envelope, then, you know, we can then look at what could we build if we had $100 billion over the next 10 years, where, why. Efficiency can kind of hopefully come into the equation of how we can do that to stretch some of those dollars further. So it's maybe there's another way to think about you know, the funding and then and the different sources. Maybe a way to think about it is through affordability, and then some of that might actually open up the question around the level of service or the type of service that citizens want from our infrastructure investment, and whether that could change or does need to change as well when you also bring in technology and digitalisation.
Great, thank you, Leilani, and thank you, panelists, for some very thoughtful answers there. We're now going to go through some of the audience questions, of which we have many. I think this first one I'll be starting with you, Vinny. So Luke Fisher asks, some of the comments seen in a recent interview with Dr. Sean Sweeney is that there ought to be a Ministry of Works for New Zealand that could address the issue of politicisation. What is the panel's view of this sort of idea? Vinny, I'm going to start with you because you are, of course, working for a successor organisation of New Zealand's Ministry of Works with WSP in New Zealand. But Leilani and Simon, it'd be great to get your reflections on this as well, very briefly after Vinny. So over to you, Vinny.
Thanks, Murray. And I'm actually relatively new to WSP, but there are people here who did start their careers in the Ministry of Work, so that legacy definitely still lives on. I think it's we have been there, we've had that, and we've moved away. And generally, in Western nations around the world, they've moved away from a Ministry of Works approach. I think the ability to bring new innovations into how we procure, deliver, operate infrastructure. There's a lot of benefits from what can be attracted from a private viewpoint. That's not to say you want to let the private sector, have at it and sort of have free reign over how they deliver these things. I think there's definitely a role for government in being effective at commissioning, at procuring and managing these infrastructure assets. Historically, if you look at Ministry of Works, they don't necessarily bring in the top talent from around the world, especially in the speed at which technology is evolving at the moment. So the ability to tap into private parties who might be able to just bring a little bit of this and a little bit of that globally at the right times can be really beneficial, as opposed to having to in-house all that knowledge and then retain and pay for that on an ongoing basis. I think the focus in the public sector should be being a really effective commissioner of that work.
Leilani, Simon, Kelly.
I thought I just thanks, Murray. I thought the interesting connection between the Ministry of Works potentially depoliticising. I'm not sure necessarily that would be the outcome that you would get if you decided to set up a Ministry of Works or some equivalent. I completely agree with Vinny that it's around it's right time, right place. I think we have seen many other jurisdictions disaggregate, centralise, then reaggregate in particular sectors, and that's a lot about centralising the right capability and capacity for the right time. As we know, all those sort of movements are quite disruptive. I think the point around depoliticising, I think, is largely around pipeline. And if we can kind of get the long-term planning and long-term pipeline work that InfraCom are now well underway in terms of trying to develop, that has some level of bipartisanship agreement, which it's pleasing to see that there is some appetite for that, then that'll go some way, I would have thought, towards the depoliticising things. However, we cannot be naive to think that there will never be politics in this space, because there will be. Decisions are made by the governments of the day against their priorities, and that goes as much for investment in infrastructure as well. But with an independent commission providing advice that's independent around what should be invested in, when and why, there's an ability, I suppose, to hold governments to account against that particular long-term plan and pipeline that they produce.
Simon, do you want to jump in?
Completely agree with those two thoughts. I guess if the Ministry of Works idea is about capability, capacity, then yes, a long-term pipeline is the way to go. I think it's also about getting some of our political settings right. 3-year terms for both central and local government does drive towards this very short-term decision-making. It politicises projects that are being delivered towards the end of terms. I think looking at kind of some of those settings could be quite useful there. Certainly, it does make things a bit short-term. In local government, we have to do 30-year infrastructure plans and 10-year long-term plans. Central government doesn't have that same discipline. And it would be useful if things like a national spatial plan that worked with the spatial planning done by local government could actually come up with some of this consensus and kind of build some of this. We don't have the big national discussions that are required to build that consensus. And yes, it's useful to have experts suggesting what the right answers are, but completely agree with Leilani that these are inherently questions of value and where you want to place value and emphasis. So it's not that they're not political, they are political. It's about how we make those decisions together that we actually stay the course, I think, is more important.
Thanks, Simon. So we've got a lot of questions on cross-party agreement and politicisation, which I think have been pretty well covered just now. So another very popular question we've had, and I don't know if we've got any rail experts on the panel, but I'll float it and someone can grab it if they've got some views. It's a question from Niall Robertson. In this time of climate change, how do we get more sensible investment in a national rail network, as rail seems to be undervalued in New Zealand? We have a panelist with a view on that one.
Is that you, Vinny?
I'm not going to jump in as a rail expert, Kelly.
I was just going to say, just briefly there, looking at those fairness principles is quite interesting when you look at rail, because I think we're not very good at thinking about all the benefits that rail brings, and I think it's not just the person who's sitting on the train that's benefiting, it's the person who's sitting on their car driving alongside the train and having a much better journey, because a lot of people are sitting on the train and they're not sitting in traffic. It's also the people who have houses near to stations, for example. It's businesses that have houses near stations. So I think if we can get those sort of conversations going a bit better about who actually benefits from infrastructure and how we then therefore spread the funding as a result of that, rather than just thinking about user pays, I think that could go a long way to helping us see rail as more valuable.
I would say, Murray, the idea of having a 30-year infrastructure pipeline, something that we have a high certainty of sticking to, would help us better assess the true costs and benefits of rail. I think rail is something that, if you deliver small discrete parts of a rail network, you don't unlock the full benefits. If New Zealand a century ago had invested significantly more in rail, we may be more willing to invest to upkeep that now. You see that in a lot of countries that have that infrastructure in place. It would be a significant cost over a long period of time to bring New Zealand up to the standard of some other countries. And the only way that we can really assess as to whether or not that's a good idea is by having that long-term view and having the confidence that that long-term plan will be delivered, so we can make investment in a piece now.
Thanks, Vinny. That's very helpful. If our panelists can stick around for a few more minutes, we might try and get through a couple more questions, given we've had so many really insightful questions come through. Obviously, if viewers need to sign out on midday, they're certainly free to do so. So this next question comes from Timo Neubauer. We seem to have a build what we like approach to infrastructure investment. Does that need to change to build what we need approach that takes a closer look at ongoing operational costs of different options? And talking here about our addiction to low density urban sprawl, which is placing a pretty big financial cost on our infrastructure. So who would like to take a run at this question of potentially changing a build what we like approach to a build what we need approach?
I'm happy to, Murray. Look, I think that sort of perspective is consistent with some of my earlier comments, around looking and the need really for this long-term planning and this long-term pipeline. And they're the sorts of decisions and conversations and considerations that work needs to take into account. Like what do New Zealanders need in terms of services that we expect into the future? And what role does infrastructure and infrastructure investment play in delivering those services that we want to have or that we need to have as New Zealanders? Some of that services need will come from different ways of getting those services. So not all of them will be infrastructure solutions. And then in the infrastructure solutions, what are our existing assets that can be used to meet those needs, and then what new investments. So we do tend to think about it as new investment primarily, but we do have an existing sort of bunch of assets that provide services today, but we actually need to think about infrastructure in the context of, it's not, infrastructure itself is not a means to an end. It's actually a means to a service end for citizens, and think that it's not always going to be an infrastructure solution to the services that we need. I know that sounds like a very high level sort of response, and it is, but I think because the missing piece for us to be able to be very specific is that we don't yet have a long-term plan. And I agree with Simon that integrated one between local government and central will be very helpful. National spatial planning, as well as the pipeline, is going to be very helpful to setting, I guess, the sort of direction for all of us to be able to answer some of the very specific questions that are being asked at the moment.
Thanks, Leilani. We'll put another one up to the panel on value capture taxes. So question from Paul Miller, with 511 billion being made from those who gain from the property market, a large percentage of this was made on the back of costly infrastructure. This group has paid the least despite their gains being the biggest. And then a comment not necessarily about moving to full capital gains, but some kind of land value capture being connected to rezoning. Is that something, Simon, you want to have a run at? Or no, Carly, you've got views here as well?
Sure. I'm sure Vinny also has views as well. I mean, certainly very supportive of value capture mechanisms being part of the funding toolbox for local government, not just as a funding source, but as something that addresses that speculation associated with land. I guess the other thing that I'd say is potentially looking at mechanisms that mean that council isn't sort of rezoning, and then when infrastructure needs to go through, you're having to procure land at that increased inflated cost. I guess the other thing I'd say is this is very timely, given that the Minister for RM reform has signalled that he wants councils to live zone 30 years of supply. That potentially is going to lead to quite a lot of increase in the value of land in those areas that are live zoned. So it's very, very timely. But long story short, very, very keen to see value capture mechanisms enabled for councils. Thanks,
Simon. Vinny or Carly, quick reflections on that?
I was just going to say, I think value capture is something that people have spoken about for so long, you know, without truly understanding what it means or figuring out how to do it. The best way to capture value is to actually own the land. And there's good examples in, you know, some of the Scandinavian countries where, you know, in advance of large metro systems being put in, land around stations is bought. It's very hard to do that in our sort of fiscally constrained and you know, public consultation environments. But, you know, like at a very minimum, what Simon talked about, where planning is being done, particularly around rezoning, we've got to make sure that we're more strategic, we're more proactive in how we're protecting, securing land for the essential elements of growth for, you know, whether it's roads, water, school, parks, community facilities, so that we're not having to purchase those at the upzoned values.
Yeah, and I was also just going to say very quickly, because I know we're finishing. I really like the windfall tax option that the Productivity Commission put forward in 2019. That, you know, if property goes up significantly in value as a result of a new piece of infrastructure being built nearby, some of that money should be able to be recouped towards the cost of the infrastructure. I think that just makes really good fairness sense. The only thing I would say about that is we need to make sure we do it in such a way that we don't price people out of an area that they've lived in for a long time because they suddenly can't afford to live there. I think that's something we really need to be really careful about. So just designing those models in a way that it targets the people who are making money on speculation rather than the people who want to keep living in an area that they just have been in for a long time. So
thanks. Thanks, Carly. Just before we finish, we've got a great question here, which we haven't really touched on today. If one of our panelists wants to give us 20 or 30 seconds on domestic workforce development, where is our workforce at the moment for infrastructure, and is that holding us back? We'll throw that to the panel for a final thought.
Vinny, is it you? If not, I can say that we are significantly behind in terms of our workforce, and to get what we need done, I think we're going to be needing to build that up quite substantially. Vinny, you're going to.
Yeah, I think I mentioned before. There's the boots on the ground doing the work, but then there's the actual, there's the people in the leadership positions managing that workforce effectively. And we have a shortage of both. I think you can build up from the bottom up, but it takes time, and having that pipeline will give us the comfort that will happen, and those people will have good high skilled jobs going forward. I speaking from personal experience, you want to go and work on exciting sexy projects through your career, and if we've got we should have a good pipeline of those. We've got a lot of stuff that we need to build. So if you finish working on a central interceptor project in Auckland, there should be another good project for you to go on to that's going to challenge you and help you sort of build. But in the short term, we're going to have the need to attract that talent from overseas. I'd say particularly in those program director, project director roles, to make sure that these projects have the oversight that they need. The bigger projects get, the more complex they get.
Thanks, Vinny, and thanks very much to all of our panelists today, Leilani, Vinny, Simon, and Carly. That's been a fascinating discussion with some really in-depth answers and some really great questions from our audience, so thank you as well. We hope to see some of you back for our next webinar, which happens to be tomorrow at midday, looking at the global impact of the US elections. And then in a couple of months' time, we'll be co-hosting a webinar on congestion charging with the New Zealand initiative. So keep an eye out for that in your inboxes. And finally, just a reminder, you should get feedback forms either in your browser as you're closing out of this webinar or in your inbox in the next couple of days. We'd love to hear what you think. So until then, noho ora mai, mā te wā, and thank you all very much for joining today.
Thanks, everyone.
Kia ora.